Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I'm David Hochschartner. As most of you know, everyone just calls me Hawk, head of North Country School and Camp Treetops. I'm delighted to welcome you to From Alarm to Action, What Works? A panel discussion on issues of climate change and energy policy. As the leader of this event's two sponsoring organizations, I could not be more honored to introduce our participants, all of whom have direct and strong ties to camp and school. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard Rockefeller, Tom Steyer, Bill McKibben, and Amy Davidsen.
Thank you, Hawk. And I have to say, it's a real pleasure for me to be up here with a panel of really incredibly committed environmentalists that are really putting their heart and soul into climate change. And I just am very appreciative personally for that. So I want to start off actually first with Bill McKibben, because he's an author, as we all know, and an activist. And he has been communicating and distilling the urgency of climate change since his first book in 1989, The End of Nature, and also with a fantastic article in Rolling Stone magazine that he did, I guess, in July of 2012 called Global Warming's Terrifying New Math. So, Bill, would you just share with the audience and try to paint the picture for us about the urgency and the latest science and where we are?
Sure. This is a pretty fast evolving story. We've concluded that we've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.7 or 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's enough heat, it turns out, to melt the Arctic, or about 80% of the sea ice in the Arctic. It's enough extra carbon in the atmosphere that the oceans are about 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. It's warm enough, since warm air holds more water vapor than cold, to make the atmosphere about 5% wetter, thus loading the dice for both drought, which we see in far greater profusion and severity, and for flood, because once that water's up in the atmosphere, it's going to come down. This is the biggest thing in the world that has ever happened. The 1 degree that we've increased the temperature so far is just the beginning. If we keep at it, it'll be 3 or 4 degrees before the campers who are currently at Treetops are as old as some of the people in this room. And that will mean a planet on which we can't conduct a civilization of the kind that we're used to.
Let me just stay on the sort of the alarm issue here. I think Secretary Kerry was stating that from the IPCC report that if this isn't an alarm bell, then I don't know what one is. If ever there were an issue that demanded greater cooperation, partnership, and committed diplomacy, this is it. It seems like we're just hitting the snooze button on the alarm. Tom, what are your thoughts? Why do you think it's not resonating as the greatest issue of our time?
From my point of view, this is a political problem that is susceptible to a political solution, but it's very difficult. But in the instances when we've engaged politically on this topic around the country, not just in California, so we've probably done 5 campaigns at this point, we think we can win everywhere in the United States if we engage directly on this problem in the ways that we think work.
So we hear that we're stuck politically. Richard, what are your thoughts in terms of, you're a medical doctor as well as a philanthropist from a very prominent family. What's your approach and what's your thinking about why we're not moving as quickly as we should be on climate change?
My own angle on this comes from years of trying to reconcile both a humanitarian and an environmental bent, because they so often feel at odds with one another. And I myself began as a rather extreme environmentalist and almost anti-humanist, despite the fact that I am a family doctor and took care of I liked individual humans, but collectively, not so much. I want to speak specifically about the relation of humans to time, because that's the crux of the issue in environmentalism. If you do not, people always say they care about their children and their grandchildren, and some people say they care about what happens to their great-grandchildren. But if they can't actually devote energy and their own resources to that future, they're not going to do anything. They're going to vote their near-term interests, not their long-term interests, which is what you see. 70% of people care about global warming, but they don't vote to change what we're doing to the environment.
Right. I'm going to go back to Tom here and ask you a question, because you're a very successful former hedge fund manager. So I know that you are now devoting your time looking at climate change, not necessarily just from an environmental point of view, but from an economic point of view.
Right.
And often we hear we have to trade off the jobs and the economy for the environment. It was either this either-or paradigm. So what's your response to that, or how do you?
Well, obviously, I think that's a bunch of baloney. I think one of the ways that people have tried to stymie any progress on this is by making the argument that dealing successfully from an environmental standpoint will cost us a great deal economically. And it is exactly what Richard was talking about, is saying in the short run, this has got to be bad for us. So maybe they'll be right in the long run, maybe they won't be right, but who the hell knows? And in the meantime, you're going to be out of work, or your cousin's going to be out of work, or your son or daughter's going to be out of work. And actually, the fact of the matter is, I think that if we, in fact, take on this challenge that Bill was describing and change our economy so that we are actually on a sustainable path from an energy standpoint, it will be one of the great challenges we've ever taken on, and it will also be one of the great job creators that we've ever taken on. If anyone is wondering whether we can solve this, I am highly confident, in the words of Drexel Burnham, that we can solve this. We have the ability to change really radically and really successfully and innovate. And American business is fantastic when you give them the right incentives. And when they change the rules on energy, we will have 1,000 innovations that no one in this room has thought about, that no one in this world has conceived of. And we will be creating energy cleanly, and we will be generating it and using it in a way that's sustainable. And we'll get very rich, and everyone will go like, it was so obvious.
So I'm going to take it back to North Country School and Treetops and just hear from each of you how it influenced you and how the school or schools like it can, or camps like it, can help the kids in the future. Like, we've got our wonderful children, and how do we give them the hope, and what's there for them?
One of the extraordinary things about North Country School, where I went for 3.5 years, part of the time with David Conliffe, who's here, was a freedom that a private school in those days had that public schools didn't have, and they have even less these days. So that's troubling. That is the freedom of teachers to pass along their own personal inspiration to the kids, whatever those kinds of inspirations might be. And then the other was to the beauty around you. So I had what William James would have called a religious experience. At around age 14, I was on the lake hill watching a sunset. I get emotional still thinking about this. The sudden, first of all, just the astonishing beauty and this kind of expanding sense of, I'm part of this. I got to live this life. And it supports me. And you could have done that in many places, but the idea that North Country encouraged you to just get out and find what you're going to find was astonishing.
Well, I want to try and be a little analytical about what Richard just said, because what he just said, from my point of view, is this is not just a question of our heads. This is a huge question of where our hearts are. And, Treetops, I didn't go to North Country School, so I can't really opine on it. But I had a very dichotomous education. And I went to an all-boys school where you wore a tie in kindergarten. And then in 4th grade, my mother said, we're going to go to this co-ed camp. And the headmaster called her in to say, at Camp Treetops, Mrs. Steyer, they dance in the nude. Unfortunately, that was a lie. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think anyone who's sitting up here is doing it because it's a calculated, intelligent thing to do. I don't think the reason that we should be acting on this is because we're doing a discounted cash flow on it. I don't think, if you look back at the great things that have happened in the United States of the world, the things that people have been willing to really risk themselves for and take much bigger risks, personally than we've been taking. It wasn't because they were they thought it was a smart thing to do. They were doing things that they really believed in, that they cared about, that they're passionate about, that have all to do with their heart. And I actually think this won't happen until people decide that this is something that we have to do for reasons that have nothing to do with economics, that have everything to do with who we are and what we care about and where our hearts are.
The message of a consumer society that we grow up in is that you're the most important thing in the world. And the very bracing and helpful message of being out in the woods or on top of the mountain or whatever is that you are a small part of something very large. I don't know. I liked going to visit camp more than just about any other day of the year, I think, just to see everybody engaged with each other and engaged with the natural world and not engaged with anything else, none of the rest of the stuff that's come to mark our society, just, not forbidden or, whatever, but just not there because there wasn't room for it. Everybody was so busy and so thrilled to be where they were with who they were doing what they were. It is a really, really special place.
I think on that note, thank you.